Young seamstress buys coffee for a poor black old man. Her life changes when his son shows up. The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from Alara's fingers, the warmth from her small apartment, and the last embers of hope from her heart. Outside, the world had vanished under a relentless shroud of white. The snowstorm, now in its third day, had buried the town of Havenwood, sealing it off from a world that had already felt impossibly distant. Inside her combination workshop and living space, the air was sharp and thin. A single, bare bulb flickered overhead, its wavering light a fragile pulse against the encroaching gloom. The aged radiator in the corner offered only a mournful metallic sigh, its promise of heat long dead. Alara sat before her sewing machine, a heavy, black singer that had been her grandmother's. It was the one solid, dependable thing in her life, a silent partner in her struggle. Her hands, nimble and calloused from a lifetime of stitching, were tucked under her arms, a futile attempt to coax some life back into them. Poverty was a different kind of cold. It was an ache deep in the bones, a constant, gnawing hunger that food could only temporarily appease. It was the shame that burned in her cheeks when she had to tell a customer she couldn't afford the specific shade of silk thread they requested. It was the weight of the ledgers on her small desk, her father's debts now hers to carry, each number a stone pulling her further under. Her parents, gone too soon in a cruel twist of fate, had left her with this small shop, their legacy of craft, and a mountain of obligations that felt as vast and impassable as the snow-choked mountains surrounding the town. She was 24, an orphan in a town that offered pity but no real help, her talent for turning simple cloth into things of beauty a quiet, uncelebrated magic. The dresses she made were whispers of a life she couldn't afford to live, hanging like ghosts in the dim light. Her gaze drifted to the small metal tin on the shelf. It held $7.43. That was everything. All that stood between her and absolute zero. A loaf of bread and a small carton of milk, or the spool of navy thread she needed to finish Mrs. Gable's morning dress. The dress was her only pending order, the $50 promised for it a lifeline she desperately needed. But Mrs. Gable was a fastidious woman. The thread had to be an exact match. It was a cruel equation. Eat today, or work for a chance to eat tomorrow. The hunger in her stomach was a dull, familiar throb, but the thought of failing, of shuttering the shop that was her last connection to her family, was a pain far sharper. She pulled her thin sweater tighter around her shoulders, the worn wool a poor defense against the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The decision made itself as it always did. The work came first. Hope, however faint, lay in the needle and thread. She decided a cup of coffee from the diner down the street was a justifiable expense. It was 95 cents for a refillable cup of bitter, watery brew, but it came with four walls that held the heat and the low hum of other people's lives. It was an illusion of warmth, an illusion of belonging, and she would pay for it. Pulling on her threadbare coat and wrapping a hand-knitted scarf around her face, she stepped out into the swirling chaos. The wind bit at her exposed skin, and the snow crunched under her worn boots. The street was deserted, a landscape of white mounds and skeletal trees. The familiar sign for Martha's Place, its neon letters buzzing weakly, was a lone beacon in the oppressive grayness. The bell above the diner door jingled, announcing her arrival with a cheerfulness that felt like a lie. The air inside was thick with the smell of frying bacon and hot coffee, a scent so rich and comforting it almost made her dizzy. Martha, a woman whose face was a permanent roadmap of disapproval, glanced up from the grill, offered a curt nod, and turned back to her work. Alara slid into a booth by the window, the cracked vinyl cold against her legs. She ordered her coffee, placing a single, crumpled dollar bill on the counter. As the hot ceramic mug warmed her hands, she watched the snow fall, each flake a tiny, perfect crystal, beautiful and deadly in its accumulation. It was then that the bell jingled again. The man who entered seemed to bring the storm in with him. He was old, his dark skin weathered and creased like ancient leather. A thin, ragged coat was pulled tight around his stooped shoulders, and a dusting of snow sat upon his graying hair like a crown of frost. He moved slowly, deliberately, his breath coming in visible puffs of white. He didn't approach the counter but stood by the door, stamping the snow from his broken boots, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet, weary dignity. A wave of murmurs rippled through the few patrons. Havenwood was a town that noticed outsiders, especially ones who looked as if they carried the weight of the world on their back. Martha turned from the grill, her spatula held like a scepter. Her voice was flat, devoid of warmth. "We're not a shelter. You buying something or just warming your bones?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The old man flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. He didn't answer, merely looked at the menu board, his gaze lingering on the prices as if trying to decipher a foreign language. Alara felt a pang in her chest, a feeling of recognition. She knew that look. It was the quiet calculus of the poor, the silent tallying of what you need versus what you can have. It was a math she did every single day. And in that moment, the thread, the dress, the debt, it all faded away. There was only the man, the cold, and the simple, undeniable truth of his need. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to hold onto her meager savings, to survive. $6.48. That was the new total. Not enough for bread and milk. Barely enough for the thread. To spend any of it on a stranger was not just foolish. It was a form of self-destruction. Mr. Croft, her landlord, was due to collect the rent in 2 days. He was a man with a heart like a shriveled stone, and he would not accept excuses. Eviction was not a threat. It was a promise. She could already feel the bite of the wind inside her apartment, her sewing machine left out in the snow. Her own desperation was a physical presence, a cold hand gripping her throat. She looked at the old man, who was now turning to leave, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He hadn't said a word, hadn't begged or pleaded. He had simply accepted the diner's unspoken verdict. But Alara's grandmother used to say that a person's true wealth is measured by what they give away when they have nothing. The words, a distant memory from a warmer time, echoed in her mind. She thought of her parents, who had always kept a pot of soup on the stove for anyone who knocked on their door, even when their own cupboards were lean. Their legacy wasn't the debt, it was the kindness. To turn away now would be to betray them, to betray the very core of who she was. She couldn't do it. The cost was too high. With a deep breath that felt like plunging into icy water, she stood up. Her voice, when it came, was soft but clear, cutting through the diner's low hum. "Wait," the old man paused, his hand on the door. Martha shot Alara a venomous glare. "He's with me," Alara said, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence. She walked toward him, forcing a small, trembling smile. "Please," she said, gesturing to her booth. "Let me buy you breakfast. It's too cold to be out there with nothing warm in your belly." The man looked at her, his dark eyes deep and searching. For a moment, she saw a flicker of suspicion, the caution of a man long accustomed to the world's cruelty. But then it softened, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. He gave a slow, formal nod. "Thank you, child," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He followed her to the booth and sat down stiffly. Alara walked to the counter, her back straight, feeling the weight of every disapproving stare. "He'll have the number 3, she told Martha, pointing to the special. 2 eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. "And another coffee for him, please." She laid 4 of her precious dollars on the counter. The transaction felt monumental, a sacrifice laid on an altar of common decency. Martha snatched the money without a word, her lips pressed into a thin, grim line. As Alara returned to the booth, she felt a strange lightness. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was joined by something else, a quiet, defiant warmth. It was the feeling of having made the right choice, even if it was the hardest one. She had chosen compassion over currency, and in the stark, cold diner it felt like a victory. The cost was real and terrifying, but for the first time in a long time she didn't feel poor. The silence that settled between them was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space of quiet understanding. The storm raged outside the diner's large plate glass window, but inside their small booth, a fragile peace took hold. When Martha brought the food, she slammed the plate down in front of the old man with unnecessary force. He paid her no mind, simply bowing his head for a moment in a silent gesture of thanks before picking up his fork. He ate slowly, with a deliberate, measured grace that seemed at odds with his tattered clothes. There was an elegance in the way he held his silverware, a precision in the way he buttered his toast. Alara sipped her coffee, watching him, her own hunger a distant echo. Seeing him eat, seeing the warmth return to his face, was more nourishing than any meal she could have bought for herself. She noticed the bracelet on his wrist. It was a thick band of braided black leather, worn and supple with age. In the center, a small, intricate silver charm was woven into the strands. It looked like a raven, or perhaps a crow, its wings outstretched. It was a piece of quiet craftsmanship, something made with care and skill. It didn't fit the picture of a destitute man. It was a small, intriguing detail, a question mark in the story she had constructed for him. "That's a beautiful bracelet," she said softly, breaking the silence. He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and looked down at his wrist as if he'd forgotten it was there. He touched the silver charm with his thumb. "A gift," he said, his voice low. "From my son. He says it's to guide me home." He didn't elaborate, and Alara didn't press. They finished the meal in that same companionable quiet. When he had eaten every last crumb, he wiped his mouth with a napkin and pushed the plate away, leaning back against the vinyl seat with a sigh of deep satisfaction. "I have not had a meal like that in a long time," he said, his eyes meeting hers. They were clear and intelligent, holding a depth of experience that was both intimidating and comforting. "My name is Samuel. I'm Alara," she replied. "Thank you, Alara," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like a benediction. "Kindness is a seed. You plant it in barren ground, and you never know what will grow. But it always grows." He slid out of the booth, his movements less stiff than before. He reached into his coat as if to find a wallet, then stopped, a flicker of embarrassment crossing his face. Alara shook her head quickly. "It was my pleasure, Samuel. Please, just be safe." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once more. "You too, child." He turned and walked to the door, pushing it open and disappearing back into the white fury of the storm. As Alara gathered her coat, she saw it lying on the seat where he had been. The leather bracelet. He must have taken it off to wash his hands and forgotten it. She scooped it up, the leather still warm from his skin, and rushed to the door, but he was already gone, swallowed by the snow. She clutched the bracelet, a strange premonition settling over her. This was not the end of their story. The walk back to her apartment was a battle. The wind had gained a new, vicious edge, and the snow was now falling in thick, heavy sheets that blinded her. When she finally stumbled through her own doorway, shivering and breathless, the first thing she saw was the notice. It was a stark white envelope, not mailed, but wedged into the crack of her door. Her name was scrawled across the front in a spidery, impatient hand. Her heart sank. She knew who it was from before she even opened it. Mr. Silas Croft. The letter inside was brutally short and devoid of any civility. It was a final demand for 2 months of back rent, plus a newly invented late fee. The total was an astronomical sum, utterly impossible for her to pay. The final sentence was underlined twice. "You have 48 hours to remit payment in full, or eviction proceedings will commence without further notice." 48 hours. The words felt like a death sentence. The illusion of warmth she'd felt in the diner vanished, replaced by a cold, stark terror that was worse than the storm. She sank onto her stool, the letter trembling in her hand. The shop felt like a tomb. The dress forms stood like silent accusers. The bolts of fabric on the shelves seemed to mock her with their vibrant, useless colors. She looked at the $2.48 left in her tin. It was laughable, a joke. She had traded a chance, however slim, for a stranger's breakfast. The weight of her choice pressed down on her. Had she been a fool? Had her grandmother's words been nothing more than a pretty sentiment, useless in the brutal reality of the world? Doubt, cold and insidious, began to creep in. Later that evening, as the storm howled its fury, there was a heavy, insistent pounding on her door. It wasn't the timid knock of a customer. It was the sound of authority, of impatience. She opened it to find Mr. Croft himself, his fleshy face red from the cold and his small, cruel eyes narrowed. He pushed past her into the room, his expensive overcoat scattering melted snow onto her clean floor. "I trust you received my correspondence," he said, his voice a smug sneer. "I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page, Miss Adams. The deadline is firm." He looked around the small apartment, his gaze lingering on the faded wallpaper and the old furniture with open disdain. "It's a shame," he said, a false note of pity in his voice. "A girl like you all alone." But business is business. His presence filled the small space, sucking all the air out of it. She felt small and powerless, a cornered animal. All she could do was nod, her throat too tight to speak. He gave a satisfied smirk, then left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving the cold and the fear behind him. The next day passed in a haze of quiet panic. The storm finally broke, but the world outside was paralyzed, entombed in a silent, glittering prison of ice and snow. The town was shut down. No one was coming for a dress fitting. No one was bringing in alterations. The phone didn't ring. There was no hope of a last-minute miracle. Alara spent the day cleaning, organizing, and mending her own clothes, the rhythmic pull of the needle and thread the only thing keeping her mind from splintering. She held Samuel's leather bracelet, running her thumb over the silver crow. It was a tangible reminder of her choice, a choice that had led her directly to this precipice. She didn't regret it, not truly, but the consequences were terrifyingly real. As dusk began to fall, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of lavender and gray, a new sound intruded on the profound silence. It started as a low, distant rumble, a vibration she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. It grew steadily louder, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the frozen town. Curious, she went to her shop window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted glass. What she saw made her breath catch. A line of motorcycles, big, black, chrome-flecked machines, was slowly making its way down the unplowed main street. They moved with a slow, predatory grace, their headlights cutting through the twilight. The men riding them were large and imposing, clad in black leather vests adorned with patches. The townspeople, emerging from their homes like groundhogs after a long winter, stared in stunned, fearful silence. This was Havenwood, a town where the most exciting event was the annual bake sale. A motorcycle club arriving in the dead of winter was an invasion. They parked in a neat, disciplined line directly in front of Martha's diner. The man at the front, clearly the leader, swung his leg off his bike. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a stern, unreadable face and a thick, dark beard. He scanned the street, his eyes seeming to miss nothing. His gaze passed over Alara's shop, and for a terrifying second, she felt as though he was looking right at her. Then, to her astonishment, he dismounted and began walking directly toward her door. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. What could they possibly want with her? The town's fear was infectious, and 100 terrible scenarios played out in her head. She heard the heavy crunch of boots on the snow-covered porch, followed by a firm, solid knock on her door. It was not the angry pounding of Mr. Croft, but it was no less intimidating. Taking a steadying breath, she opened the door a crack. The man stood on her porch, his sheer size blocking out the fading light. Up close, she could see the patch on his leather vest. It was an intricate design of a crow in flight, its wings spread wide, identical to the charm on Samuel's bracelet. "Miss Alara Adams?" he asked. His voice was a deep baritone, calm and respectful. It was not what she expected. She nodded, unable to speak. "My name is Marcus," he said. "I'm looking for my father." An old man named Samuel. We were told he came through here yesterday. Someone said he stopped at the diner." He paused, his eyes scanning her face. "They said a young woman bought him a meal." Relief washed over Alara, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. "Yes," she breathed. "He was here. I was worried about him." In the cold, Marcus's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly at the corners. "He has moments where he gets lost," he explained, a hint of pain in his voice. "He wanders. We always find him. But this storm—" He trailed off. "Did he say where he was going?" Alara shook her head. "No. He just thanked me and left." Then she remembered. "But he left this." She hurried back inside and retrieved the leather bracelet from her workbench. She held it out to Marcus. He took it, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. He looked at the bracelet, then back at her, and for the first time, she saw a genuine warmth in his eyes. "This is his," he confirmed. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." He turned to leave, then hesitated. "You showed my father kindness when no one else would. The Iron Crows don't forget things like that. If you ever need anything, you let me know." The Iron Crows. So that was their name. Before she could process his words, another figure appeared on the street. It was Mr. Croft, his face a mask of outrage. He had seen the bikers and had clearly come to his own malevolent conclusions. He marched toward her porch, his finger pointed accusingly at Marcus. "There you are. I knew it. Consorting with criminals. This is the last straw, Miss Adams." Mr. Croft didn't even seem to register the sheer physical presence of Marcus and the dozen other bikers who were now watching the scene with quiet, unnerving intensity. His rage was focused entirely on Alara. "I'm calling the sheriff," he shrieked, pulling out his phone. "We'll have you and your degenerate friends out of my building and out of this town by morning." Marcus turned his head slowly to look at Croft, a silent, deadly calm settling over his features. He didn't say a word, but the threat was palpable. The situation was escalating into a nightmare. Sheriff Brody arrived minutes later, his cruiser sliding to a stop in the snow. He was a man who operated on assumption and prejudice, and the sight of a dozen leather-clad bikers in his town had clearly set his teeth on edge. "What's the trouble here?" he demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. "This filth is trespassing and intimidating my tenant," Croft sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "And she," he added, turning his venom on Alara, "is harboring them. I want them gone and I want her out. Effective immediately." Sheriff Brody looked at Alara, his eyes cold and judgmental. "Miss Adams, is this man bothering you? Are these men threatening you? Just say the word, and I'll handle it." Here it was, her final test. A clear, simple path had been laid out for her. All she had to do was lie. She could nod, say yes, paint herself as a victim. The sheriff would remove the bikers, Croft would be placated, and she might even buy herself some time, some sympathy. It was the logical choice, the self-preservation choice. Her home, her livelihood, everything hung in the balance. She looked at Marcus, who stood silent and impassive, his gaze fixed on her. He wasn't pleading or coercing. He was waiting, watching to see who she truly was. She thought of Samuel, of his quiet dignity. She thought of the promise she'd made to herself in the diner. She straightened her shoulders, her fear solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. "No, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing out in the frigid air, clear and unwavering. "They are not threatening me. This man," she gestured to Marcus, "is looking for his lost father. Mr. Croft is the one who has been harassing me. He is trying to evict me illegally in the middle of a snowstorm." A collective gasp went through the small crowd of townsfolk who had gathered to watch. Mr. Croft's face turned a shade of purple. The sheriff looked taken aback, his simple narrative of good versus evil suddenly complicated. "Is that so?" he said, his eyes narrowing. "That's a lie," Croft shrieked. Marcus finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. "It's the truth, and my father is Samuel Kane. This young woman showed him a kindness my family will never forget. He looked from Croft to the sheriff, a silent challenge in his eyes. "We aren't here for trouble, but we don't tolerate disrespect. And we don't abide bullies." He took a half-step forward, and both Croft and the sheriff instinctively took a step back. The power dynamic on the small porch had shifted completely. Alara had made her choice. She had stood for the truth, and in doing so had thrown her lot in with the strangers. She braced herself for the fallout, for the loss of everything. A flicker of respect, grudging and brief, crossed Sheriff Brody's face. He was outmatched and he knew it. He turned to Croft. "Silas, this is a civil matter. Take it up in the courts. Now, go home before you cause a real problem." Humiliated and seething, Croft shot Alara a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed, before stomping off through the snow. As the small crowd dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves, Marcus turned back to Alara. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his stern features. "You are a woman of rare character, Alara Adams," he said, his voice filled with a deep, sincere admiration. "You had an easy way out, and you didn't take it." He pulled out a sleek, modern phone that looked jarringly out of place in his rugged hand and made a quick call. He spoke in low, clipped tones. "Find him. Yes, the whole portfolio. Make the offer non-negotiable. And set up the delivery for tomorrow morning. Everything she needs." He hung up and looked back at her, his eyes warm. "Don't you worry about Mr. Croft," he said, "or anything else. The Iron Crows protect our own. And as of today, you're one of us." He nodded to his men, who had been watching silently, and they swung back onto their bikes. With a deafening roar of engines that echoed off the silent, snow-covered buildings, they rode out of town as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving Alara standing on her porch in a state of stunned disbelief. The air, once thick with tension and fear, now hummed with a strange, exhilarating promise of change. The next morning, Alara woke to a world reborn. The sun was brilliant, glinting off a pristine landscape of white. The oppressive grayness was gone, replaced by a sky of impossible blue. Felt like a metaphor. Just as she was brewing the last of her coffee, a long, black sedan, the kind she had only ever seen in movies, pulled up silently in front of her shop. A woman in a sharply tailored suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. She introduced herself as the legal counsel for a holding company Alara had never heard of. "Miss Adams," the lawyer said, her tone crisp and professional. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, my client acquired this entire building. Mr. Croft is no longer the owner." Alara stared, speechless. The lawyer continued, a small smile playing on her lips. "Furthermore, your outstanding rental debt has been forgiven in its entirety. Your lease has been replaced with a new agreement." She slid a document across the table. "My client wishes to retain you as the property manager for the residential units upstairs, at a generous monthly salary. Your own rent, for both the shop and the apartment, is, of course, waived for life." Alara's hands trembled as she looked at the paper. The numbers didn't seem real. A salary, her debt erased, her home secured. It was too much to comprehend. Before she could even find her voice, a large delivery truck rumbled up the street. Two men in overalls began unloading heavy crates. They carried in a brand-new industrial-grade sewing machine, a serger, a professional dress form, and dozens of bolts of the finest fabrics she had ever seen, silks, velvets, and cashmeres in every color of the rainbow. They were followed by another truck, this one from the grocery co-op in the next county, which delivered boxes and boxes of food, enough to last a year. And finally, the oil company came, filling her heating tank to the brim, and for the first time in years, the old radiator began to hiss and clank with the glorious promise of abundant, unending warmth. The cascade of good fortune was overwhelming, a tidal wave of generosity that left her breathless. It was a deus ex machina in the truest sense, a divine intervention delivered on the back of a motorcycle. The sheer scale of it was staggering. This wasn't just help. It was a complete and total transformation of her reality, a reward so disproportionate to her small act of kindness that it felt like a dream. The news spread through Havenwood like wildfire. People who had once pitied or ignored her now looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect. Mr. Croft's public humiliation was the talk of the town. Martha, from the diner, showed up at her door that afternoon holding a freshly baked apple pie. Her usual sour expression was replaced by one of sheepish contrition. "I was wrong about you," she said, not quite meeting Alara's eye. "And about them. This pie is on the house." It was an apology, Havenwood style, and Alara accepted it with a gracious smile. The town, forced to confront its own prejudices, was changing. The fear of the Iron Crows had been replaced by a grudging admiration. They were no longer seen as dangerous outsiders, but as agents of a strange and powerful justice. Late that afternoon, the black sedan returned. This time, when the door opened, Samuel stepped out, followed by Marcus. Samuel was transformed. He wore a fine woolen coat, tailored trousers, and polished leather shoes. The weary, destitute man from the diner was gone, replaced by a patriarch who radiated quiet power and authority. He walked up to Alara, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. "I told you kindness was a seed," he said, taking her hands in his. "Look at the garden you've grown." He introduced himself properly. Samuel Kane, founder and president of Iron Crow Logistics, a massive, privately owned firm that had grown from a small motorcycle club into a corporate powerhouse. The club was their history, their family, but their reach was global. "My son worries," Samuel said with a glance at Marcus. "He thinks my mind is fading, but sometimes I wander on purpose. It reminds me of where we came from. It shows me the true heart of the world. People like Mr. Croft, and people like you." Marcus stepped forward. "My father founded this club with one rule. You pay every debt, and you repay every kindness tenfold. You gave him your last few dollars for a hot meal. Consider this a down payment." They stayed for hours, sitting in her now warm apartment, sharing Martha's pie. They told her stories of the club's early days, of their strict code of honor. They weren't criminals. They were protectors, a family bound by loyalty. And they made it clear that she was now part of that family. They were her shield, her benefactors, her brothers, and her father. The lonely seamstress of Havenwood now had the unshakable backing of the Iron Crows. 6 months later, spring had laid its gentle hand upon Havenwood. The snow was a distant memory, replaced by green grass and blossoming trees. The sign above Alara's shop now read, "Havenwood Threads," the letters painted in a cheerful, elegant script. The shop itself was transformed, its windows bright and welcoming, showcasing her beautiful creations. Business was booming. She had hired 2 other women from town to help her keep up with the orders that were now pouring in from all over the state, thanks to a new website and a bit of marketing funded by her new family. The apartments above the shop, once run down and neglected, had been fully renovated and were now occupied by families who paid their fair rent to a kind and understanding property manager. Alara sat on her newly built front porch, a glass of iced tea in her hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. The heavy, black Singer sewing machine sat in the window of her shop, a proud relic, a reminder of where she had started. A comfortable silence settled between her and the 2 men sitting with her, Samuel and Marcus. They were regular visitors now, their motorcycles a familiar and welcome sound on the streets of Havenwood. They weren't saviors who had ridden off into the sunset. They were family, present and constant. They had dinner on the porch every Sunday. "You're happy here, kid?" Marcus asked, his deep voice softer than she'd ever heard it that first day. Alara smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached her eyes. "More than happy," she said. "I'm home." She looked out at the town, at the people strolling down the street who now waved and called out to her. She had not only survived, she had flourished. Her world was no longer cold and gray but filled with warmth, color, and connection. It served as a powerful reminder that in a world that often feels cold and unforgiving, the warmth of a single, selfless act of compassion has the power to change everything, igniting a light so bright it can banish even the deepest shadows. One small kindness, one cup of coffee, had planted a seed that had bloomed into a forest of hope, proving that the best investments are not in stocks or bonds, but in each other.